Here are 3 true ice stories. Viewer discretion is advised. These accounts are brutal and may be triggering. It was a normal, snowy day in Minneapolis, the kind where the snow had already fallen earlier in the morning and now just sat quietly on rooftops, sidewalks, and parked cars, dulling the sound of the city and making everything feel slower than usual. I was in the house next door, going about my routine, half listening to the weather report while watching the street through the front window, thinking more about errands and work than anything else. If you didn't know what was coming, it felt like any other winter day, calm in that way only snow can make things feel. That whole week, though, something had been off in a way that's hard to explain unless you lived it, because neighbors lingered outside longer than usual, and conversations didn't end naturally the way they normally did. People lowered their voices even when no one else was around, and word kept spreading that ice had been seen nearby, not just passing through, but actually stopping, watching, and showing up where they normally didn't belong. No one had proof, just sightings and secondhand stories. But fear doesn't need confirmation to take hold, and you could feel it in the way doors were locked earlier and blinds were checked more often than before. By midweek, it felt like we were all bracing for something without knowing exactly what it was, like the neighborhood was collectively waiting for bad weather that never showed up on the forecast. Dark vehicles started appearing on streets where they didn't belong, parked too neatly, engines running longer than necessary, drivers sitting inside without ever getting out. I remember standing at the window longer than I should have, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, but the uneasiness wouldn't go away, especially with the snow making everything so quiet it felt unnatural. The morning it happened didn't announce itself as different, because the sky was the same flat gray, and the snow still clung to the curb, making the street look almost peaceful. Then voices cut through the quiet, sharp and urgent, and I knew immediately it wasn't a normal argument or kids messing around outside. I stepped closer to the window and saw people gathering down the block, some hesitant, some already holding up phones, all of them focused on the same spot in the street. When the gunshots rang out, they sounded impossibly loud against the snow, echoing in a way that made my chest tighten before my mind could even process what was happening. Panic rippled instantly through the block as people shouted, dogs barked, and doors opened and shut again in quick succession as instinct took over. I remember backing away from the window without realizing I was moving, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was shaking my ribs. The kind of fear that makes you feel guilty just for witnessing it from inside your own home. From next door, I didn't see every detail, but I saw enough to know nothing about it was normal, including a vehicle stopped at a strange angle and agents pushing people back as neighbors cried out in disbelief. I saw one figure on the ground who wasn't moving, while the snow continued to fall softly around them. And that contrast between violence and calm is something that stays with you. It felt unreal, like the city was pretending nothing had happened, while everything about that street had changed forever. The rest of the week blurred together into sirens, helicopters circling overhead, news vans crowding the street, and neighbors gathering in small groups to share whatever information they could piece together. That's when we learned her name, Renee Good. And suddenly it wasn't just rumors or fear anymore, but a real person whose life ended on a street that had felt safe only days earlier. Even after the vehicles left and the cameras packed up, the feeling didn't go away. Because once you've seen how quickly a normal snowy day can turn into something else entirely, the quiet never feels the same again. The snow that morning looked almost peaceful, like it had fallen in a trance while the city slept, covering sidewalks and parked cars in that familiar soft white that makes everything look calmer than it really is. I was inside my house next door, watching the flakes settle against the window, not really thinking about anything in particular, because it had been a quiet winter up until then, and snowy days in Minneapolis always felt like a kind of pause, a break from the noise of life. But as the morning stretched on, that quiet began to feel heavy, as if the snow wasn't just on the ground, but pressing down on the whole world with this odd sense of waiting. Rumors had been circulating all week, low at first. Voices in grocery store aisles, neighbors whispering over fences, whispers about federal agents being seen on nearby streets, about ICE operations moving through the city, about tensions rising after what happened earlier with Renee. And even though none of it seemed like something that would touch my block, everyone's eyes kept flicking outside more often than usual. On that Friday morning, I saw the dark vehicles first, parked oddly on the corner where neighbors normally left bikes and trash bins. Then came the agents, boots on the pavement, radios buzzing, faces half hidden under hoods and masks. The air already felt thick, not just with cold, but with this unspoken worry that something was about to break. I stepped outside without really deciding to, just pulled by the tension that seemed to hang in the street, and saw people gathering down the block. Not like a protest, not yet. Just neighbors and strangers alike staring down Nicollet Avenue, gripping coffee cups and phones, unsure what to expect next. That's when I noticed him, Alex Pretty, a man I'd seen a few times walking his dog, polite enough to nod and say hello, but otherwise just another face in the city. He was out there, in the street, not yelling but filming, phone raised, watching the agents like he was trying to record something meaningful, something the rest of us couldn't yet articulate. I remember the way the snowflakes seemed to hang in the air right before the shots rang out. Not falling so much as frozen, suspended, and then the sound hit, sharp and shocking against the hush of winter. The noise seemed impossible, louder than it should have been in the cold, echoing off buildings like thunder clapped too close. People screamed and ducked instinctively. Dogs barked wildly, and for a moment, everything fractured. The calm quiet of snow, the dread that had been building all week, all of it shattered in the instant that Alex crumpled to the ground. I didn't see every detail from my front porch, just the chaos and the sudden rush of people spilling into the street, some rushing forward, others frozen with confusion and disbelief. There was shouting, some pleading, and then the agents forming some kind of perimeter. Voices sharp and urgent, telling everyone to back away. Someone's phone was still recording. Someone else was calling out Alex's name. And beneath it all, the snow kept falling, softly, like nothing had changed, even though everything had. In the days that followed, the block didn't feel the same. Neighbors stopped small talk at the fence, and instead whispered about what they'd seen, about clips of that morning going viral, about conflicting accounts from officials and video evidence that made some question the version being told from the podiums. And even now, when the snow falls like it always did before, my eyes still drift toward that corner of Nicollet Avenue, half expecting something quiet and normal, and half remembering how fragile quiet really is. I didn't know his name at first, only that he was the man in the cell down the corridor whose coughing never seemed to stop, and whose voice I heard late at night when the lights were supposed to be off and everyone was meant to sleep. The detention center was always cold in a way that felt intentional, like the air itself was meant to wear you down slowly. And that week, the chill seemed worse, seeping through thin blankets and concrete walls until no one could remember what it felt like to be warm. People whispered that tensions were high, that officers were on edge, that something had happened earlier with paperwork or transfers. And even though no one had proof, you could feel the strain in the way guards snapped orders and detainees stopped asking questions. Geraldo Lunas Campos was quiet most of the time, not withdrawn but careful, the kind of man who measured his words and kept his eyes low. And I remember thinking he looked exhausted in a way sleep couldn't fix. On the night everything went wrong, the facility felt tighter than usual, doors slamming harder, radios crackling more often, the kind of noise that keeps you awake even when your body is begging to shut down. I was lying on my bunk, staring at the ceiling, when I heard shouting down the hall. Not panicked at first, but sharp and commanding, followed by the sound of several sets of boots moving quickly in the same direction. Someone yelled Geraldo's name, and that was the moment my stomach dropped. Because names weren't supposed to be shouted like that unless something had already spiraled out of control. The voices grew louder, overlapping, orders mixed with pleading, and then came the unmistakable sound of a body hitting the floor, heavy and final, like a sack dropped from shoulder height. I couldn't see what was happening, only hear it, and that somehow made it worse, because your mind fills in gaps with things you can't unsee once they're imagined. There was a struggle, short but violent, the kind where furniture scrapes and someone gasps for air, and I remember gripping the edge of my bunk so hard my fingers went numb. Geraldo's voice came once more, strained and thin, then faded into a sound that wasn't quite silence, but wasn't breathing either, and the corridor fell eerily quiet after that. When the guards finally moved away, their footsteps were slower, heavier, and no one said anything for a long time. The next morning, the rumor spread before the official word ever did, moving cell to cell in hushed fragments, that Geraldo was dead, and that the story being told didn't match what people had heard through the walls. Officials said it was one thing, witnesses said it was another, and those of us inside knew only that a man who was alive the night before was suddenly gone, his bunk empty, his name spoken like a warning. The cold seemed sharper after that, not just in the air, but in the way everyone moved, careful not to draw attention, careful not to become the next sound in the hallway. Even now, long after that week ended, I remember how quickly everything shifted, how a place already built to strip you down found another way to do it, and how silence can feel heavier than shouting when you know what it's hiding. Geraldo Lunas Campos became a name people argued about on the outside. But inside those walls, he was simply the man whose voice stopped one night and reminded us how fragile life becomes when no one is watching closely enough.